It's been years since the quiet town of Delphi, Indiana, was thrust into the national spotlight. 2 young lives lost, a community forever marked by grief, and a case that gripped the world with questions that refused to fade. Richard Allen's 2024 conviction seemed to close a chapter many thought would never end. But in early 2025, the story took another turn, one that pulled the case back into the courtroom and reopened a discussion about truth, fairness, and justice in one of America's most haunting murder cases. The appeal process began quietly, without cameras or breaking news alerts. Yet to those who had followed every twist of the Delphi murders, it signaled something profound. The case wasn't finished. In January 2025, Allen's defense team filed a formal appeal with the Indiana Court of Appeals, challenging the very foundation of the conviction. To the legal world, it was another step in due process. To the families, the community, and the countless people who had mourned from afar, it was a reopening of deep wounds. At the center of the appeal were claims of bias and due process violations. The defense argued that the trial had been irreversibly tainted by pretrial publicity. From the moment Richard Allen's arrest made national headlines, the defense claimed an unbiased jury was impossible to find. Delphi, a town of less than 3,000, had lived the case for years, through candlelight vigils, social media discussions, and endless speculation. Even outside Delphi, coverage was constant, turning the trial into a media event. The defense's first major argument rested on that claim, that Allen's right to a fair trial had been compromised long before the first juror was sworn in. Then came the question of digital evidence. Among the most disputed pieces was data retrieved from Liberty German's phone, including timestamps, video frames, and audio segments. Investigators had described this evidence as crucial, a bridge between the crime and the man accused. But in the appeal, Allen's lawyers claimed some of that data had been introduced without proper authentication. They argued that parts of the extraction process were unclear, and that the jury had been allowed to rely on information not properly verified. It was a complex, technical argument, but one with serious implications. In an appeal, small procedural errors can become major grounds for review. The defense also turned to Allen's own words. Throughout the investigation, Allen had reportedly made statements that prosecutors described as partial admissions. The defense now alleged those words were the result of psychological pressure, exhaustion, and fear, not a genuine confession. They claimed the circumstances surrounding his statements violated his constitutional rights. To them, the confession wasn't voluntary. It was coerced. Each argument added another layer to a case already defined by uncertainty. The filing was long and dense, filled with legal citations and careful language, but beneath the technical terms lay a familiar tension, one between 2 opposing truths. The state had built a case on what it described as overwhelming evidence. The defense now sought to dismantle it, piece by piece, within the narrow framework of appellate law. As the documents were filed, legal analysts began to weigh in. Some said the appeal was routine, expected after a conviction in a high-profile case. Others believed the claims could raise real questions about the handling of evidence and public exposure. The Court of Appeals, known for its careful review process, accepted the filing. The case was given a number and the waiting began. For Delphi, the news stirred a mix of emotions. Many residents had long tried to move forward, holding on to memories of Libby and Abby while rebuilding a sense of normalcy. The conviction had brought a fragile peace. The appeal threatened to disrupt it. In coffee shops, church gatherings, and community events, the topic resurfaced, quietly, cautiously. People wanted justice, but they also wanted closure. Across social media, conversations reignited. Some called the appeal an act of desperation. Others said every defendant deserves a chance to challenge a conviction. The debate reflected a broader truth about America's legal system, that justice is rarely as simple as a verdict. Every appeal reopens the balance between accountability and fairness. Meanwhile, Allen remained incarcerated at Wabash Valley Correctional Facility, serving his sentence while awaiting the appellate process. For months, his legal team worked behind the scenes, preparing supplemental filings and motions. They requested access to sealed records, expert testimony, and the full trial transcript, arguing that transparency was essential for a fair appeal. Prosecutors countered, maintaining that the conviction had been reached lawfully and supported by evidence. The Indiana Court of Appeals set a briefing schedule. Deadlines were marked. Arguments would be presented in writing, not in person. For now, there would be no dramatic courtroom scenes, no cameras, just the slow and deliberate pace of appellate review. Every line, every citation, every motion would be examined by a panel of judges tasked with answering one question. Did the trial court make a reversible error? In the months that followed, the legal battle unfolded mostly on paper. Each new document brought small ripples through the true crime community. Legal experts explained the meaning of procedural errors and evidentiary challenges. Online discussions speculated about what might happen next, but the court remained silent, as appellate courts do. Decisions take time, sometimes months, sometimes years. By mid-2025, the appeal was fully under review. No ruling had been made, but both sides had laid their positions clearly. The defense portrayed the trial as flawed and prejudiced. The state argued it had followed the law to the letter. Delphi waited again, as it had so many times before, suspended between hope and fatigue. In the background of legal arguments, two names remained constant: Liberty German and Abigail Williams. Their families, though largely private, continued to honor them through community events, memorials, and scholarships. For them, the appeal was a reminder that justice is not a moment but a process, one that can stretch on long after headlines fade. As summer turned to fall, the case once again hovered at the edge of public attention. Reporters checked court filings, families avoided interviews, and the town carried on with quiet resilience. The bridge where it all began had long been closed to the public, but its image still lingered in the minds of many, a haunting symbol of innocence lost and the pursuit of answers. And so, the Delphi case entered yet another chapter. Slower, quieter, but just as heavy. The appeal would decide not guilt or innocence, but whether the system had worked as it should. For those who believed in Allen's guilt, it was an obstacle to closure. For those who doubted, it was a final chance for the truth to be tested. No matter the outcome, one thing was certain. The eyes of Delphi, and of the world, remained fixed on a courthouse far from that bridge, waiting for the next decision to be written. If you're following this case as closely as we are, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this update series, where we break down the state's response, the battle over transparency, and how this appeal could redefine what justice means in Delphi. The months following Richard Allen's appeal filing marked a quiet but intense stage of the Delphi murders case. The courtroom battles that once filled headlines gave way to legal paperwork, sealed motions, and the measured rhythm of judicial review. Yet beneath the surface, every document carried the weight of a town's grief and the persistence of a story that refused to fade. By spring 2025, Allen's defense had filed a series of supplemental motions that sought not only to overturn his conviction but also to reframe how the case had been handled from the beginning. Central to their strategy was transparency. They argued that too much of the trial had taken place behind closed doors, with sealed evidence, restricted testimony, and limited media access. For a case that had captivated the nation, they said the public deserved to see the full record. Their requests included the release of previously sealed exhibits, forensic reports, and the complete transcript of the proceedings. The defense claimed these materials were essential for both legal fairness and public confidence. Without them, they argued, it was impossible to know whether justice had truly been done. But prosecutors pushed back. They maintained that sensitive evidence, particularly digital files from Liberty German's phone and certain forensic images, had been sealed to protect the dignity of the victims and the integrity of the investigation. They argued that opening these records could cause renewed harm to the families and fuel speculation that blurred the line between fact and rumor. This clash, transparency versus privacy, became one of the most complex aspects of the appeal. Legal scholars and journalists began weighing in. Some agreed with the defense, noting that public trust depends on open courts. Others sided with prosecutors, reminding everyone that some truths, especially in cases involving minors, deserve protection from public consumption. Meanwhile, the state submitted its official response to Allen's appeal. The document, hundreds of pages long, was methodical and confident. Prosecutors reaffirmed that the jury's verdict was based on solid evidence, lawfully obtained and properly presented. They rejected claims of bias, noting that jurors had been carefully screened and instructed to disregard media coverage. They also addressed the defense's concerns about digital evidence. Every procedure, they argued, had followed established forensic standards. The data from Liberty German's phone, the same that captured the infamous Bridge Guy video, had been handled under strict chain of custody rules. Prosecutors stated that the defense's claims of improper authentication were not supported by the trial record. And then came the question of Allen's alleged confession. The state's response was direct. The statements were voluntary. According to the prosecution, Allen had been informed of his rights, was not under duress, and spoke with a clear understanding of his situation. They pointed out that the defense's claims of coercion were raised only after conviction, not during trial, weakening their credibility. It was a duel fought entirely through documents, one side dismantling, the other defending. Every motion was analyzed by true crime followers, every brief dissected by online communities searching for hidden meaning. But inside the Indiana Court of Appeals, there was no rush. The judge's task was not to decide emotion, but procedure. In Indiana, an appeal does not retry a case. It examines whether the trial court made an error significant enough to affect the verdict. That means most arguments hinge on technicalities, rules, evidence handling, jury instructions. To outsiders, it can feel like bureaucracy, but to those inside the system, it's the foundation of fairness. As the spring turned into summer, the court docket grew thicker. The defense submitted replies, the state responded again, and small procedural rulings trickled in. There were motions to correct clerical errors, requests for deadline extensions, and updates on the inclusion of sealed materials. Nothing dramatic, yet every page added to the slow accumulation of legal weight. Outside the legal filings, the human story continued. In Delphi, residents marked another anniversary of the girls' deaths. Memorial walks were held near the trailheads. Flowers and ribbons appeared on fences. News crews returned briefly, then moved on, leaving behind a town still balancing between remembrance and fatigue. Libby German and Abby Williams remained at the center of everything. Their families, though quiet, continued their advocacy for awareness and safety programs. They had long said that justice wasn't just about one verdict. It was about ensuring no other family endured the same pain. The appeal process for them was both necessary and exhausting. Each new development was another reminder that closure was still far away. Legal commentators began calling the Delphi case a modern study in the tension between justice and public perception. The Bridge Guy video, which once seemed to promise quick answers, had become a haunting symbol of how complicated truth can be. The appeal didn't erase the conviction, but it reminded the world that even in seemingly solved cases, certainty is fragile. Throughout mid-2025, new details emerged not about the crime itself, but about the defense's internal strategy. They emphasized systemic flaws, overworked investigators, media interference, and what they called confirmation bias during the initial investigation. They cited examples of cases where public pressure led to premature conclusions. Their tone was methodical, not emotional, as if they were building a record not only for this court but possibly for a higher one. In response, prosecutors underscored that the Delphi investigation had been one of the most scrutinized in Indiana's history. They pointed to years of work, thousands of tips, and the combination of physical, digital, and circumstantial evidence that tied Allen to the scene. To them, this was not a story of mistakes but of persistence, an example of law enforcement refusing to give up until answers were found. As the filings continued, the appellate judges reviewed each side's arguments with deliberate care. These were not the moments seen on television dramas. There were no sudden verdicts or shocking witnesses. Instead, there were quiet chambers, long pages of legal analysis, and the slow march of due process. But for those following from afar, that slowness was its own kind of suspense. When would the court decide? Would the conviction stand? Would there be a new trial? These questions hung in the air, unanswered, as months passed. By the end of summer, The court had acknowledged receipt of all necessary documents. The record was complete. The next move would belong entirely to the judges. They would study the filings, deliberate privately, and issue a written opinion when ready. No one outside the panel would know when that day might come. For now, the Delphi story entered a quiet phase once more. No headlines, no breaking updates, just the slow, unseen work of law. But inside that stillness, the stakes remained enormous. For the victims' families, for the town, and for a country still haunted by that one fragment of video captured on a winter afternoon. Because in the end, every motion, every appeal, every argument returned to that moment. Two girls on a bridge, the shadow of a stranger, and a question that echoes even years later. What truly happened, and has justice really been done? As the appeal sat with the Court of Appeals, all anyone could do was wait. The system was moving, but silently, behind walls of paperwork and protocol. And in that silence, Delphi once again found itself living between closure and uncertainty. Stay with us for the final part of this update, where we'll look at where the case stands now, the possible outcomes of the appeal, and how Delphi continues to carry the weight of the story while holding on to hope. Subscribe to follow the conclusion of this special report. The courtrooms may have gone quiet, but in Delphi, silence speaks louder than any verdict. As 2025 draws to a close, the small town once again finds itself standing still, caught between justice delivered and justice delayed. The man convicted of the Delphi murders, Richard Allen, now sits in a prison cell waiting for one decision that could either cement his fate or reopen the darkest chapter of this community's history. Inside the Indiana Court of Appeals, the atmosphere is tense yet methodical. 3 judges sift through transcripts thicker than old phone books. Every motion, every testimony, every objection from the 2023 trial. They aren't looking for guilt or innocence anymore. Their job is colder, more exact, to decide if the process itself was fair. If a single misstep in procedure occurred, everything could change. The appeal hearing, held earlier this year, was unlike any other phase of this long ordeal. Allen's attorneys delivered their arguments with a mix of desperation and defiance. They claimed evidence had been mishandled, that the crime scene's chain of custody was compromised, and that Allen's own words had been twisted under psychological pressure. They questioned the role of the leaked documents, the intense media scrutiny, and whether their client ever truly stood a chance in a town that had already branded him guilty. Prosecutors countered with precision. To them, this was a man whose own gun matched the bullet found near the girls. A man who had confessed, even if later recanted. They argued that the defense wasn't chasing justice, they were chasing shadows. That the case had already survived more scrutiny than most ever would. As the hearing ended, the courtroom fell into that kind of silence only true crime followers know well. The silence before a verdict, before fate tilts one way or the other. Outside, cameras clicked. Reporters whispered their closing stand-ups. But inside, those who'd lived this case from the beginning simply stared at the floor, knowing that after 8 long years, justice was once again being tested. The families of Liberty German and Abigail Williams were there. They didn't speak to the press, but their presence said everything. You could see it in their eyes, grief weathered by time, and an unshakable strength that's hard to describe unless you've carried a loss that never ends. They had already endured public heartbreak, online speculation, and courtroom replays of their daughter's final moments. Now all they could do was wait. In Delphi, locals had mixed feelings about the appeal. Some believed it was necessary to ensure the right person was behind bars. Others feared it would reopen wounds that had only just begun to heal. The bridge where the girls were last seen remains closed, a haunting landmark that draws visitors year after year. People leave flowers, bracelets, hand-painted stones. Small tokens for 2 lives that should have had decades ahead of them. But what most outsiders don't realize is how much this case has reshaped the town itself. Businesses, schools, even church sermons carry its shadow. Parents speak differently to their children now. Lock doors earlier. Keep closer watch. Delphi, once known for its quiet trails and family fairs, has become a name whispered on true crime podcasts and news specials around the world. And that's a burden the town never asked for. As the appeal winds deeper into deliberation, the story takes on a different tone. Less about mystery, more about endurance. Because now, what's left isn't about finding out who did it. It's about whether the system worked. Whether the years of investigations, public outrage, and courtroom battles have truly led to justice, or just exhaustion. For many who've followed this case, the appeal represents more than legal procedure. It's a reflection of something human, how we chase truth even when it hurts, how we hold on to hope even when it fades. The judge's decision could come tomorrow or months from now, but when it does, it will mark either the final chapter or the start of another painful rewrite. And yet, there's one thing that remains unchanged: the memory of Libby and Abby, two best friends who left home on a February afternoon and never returned. Their story has reached millions, but in Delphi, it's not a headline. It's personal. Their laughter still echoes in the town's collective heart, reminding everyone what this fight has always been for. The camera may have stopped rolling, the court may have adjourned, but this story isn't over. Not yet, because justice in this case was never just about punishment. It was about making sure two young lives were never forgotten. If you've followed this far, you understand why Delphi still matters. Why every update, every filing, every delayed decision carries weight. And when the appellate court finally speaks, when their decision is made public, you'll want to be here. To hear it, to understand it, and to remember why it all began. So if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. Because when the truth moves forward, even 1 inch at a time, we'll be here to follow it, with respect, with clarity, and with the promise to tell it right.